The wedding night was a cold duty, until the Duke discovered the marks she hid under silk and lace. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The first time Evelyn Hart saw Ravenska Castle, it rose out of the coastal fog like a dark ship run aground. All stone towers and narrow windows catching the last silver of the evening light. The carriage wheels jolted over the gravel drive, and every shudder traveled up through the polished wood into her spine, rattling the breath in her chest. Silk rustled softly as she steadied herself, gloved fingers tightening around the bouquet she barely felt she was holding. Across from her, Uncle Charles adjusted his cuffs, the faint scent of expensive cologne battling the salt air seeping in through the cracks in the door. "Remember why you are here, Evelyn," he said, voice smooth as if they were heading to a pleasant dinner and not to the threshold of a life she had never chosen. "Smile when you must. Speak only when spoken to. The Duke of Ravenska is a practical man. That suits us." Us, Evelyn thought, but she only nodded. The corset beneath her satin gown pressed against her ribs, a constant reminder to sit straight, to take up as little space as possible. Beneath the layers of silk and lace, faint shadows marked her skin like old storms that had never quite cleared, but they were hidden now, folded beneath fabric and expectation. Outside, gulls cried somewhere over the waves, their voices swept thin by the wind. She turned her head to the window, catching a blurred glimpse of the sea beyond the cliff, dark and restless. Then the carriage slowed. A line of torches flared along the broad staircase leading up to the main doors. Servants waited in orderly rows, black coats and crisp aprons, a silent corridor of eyes. And at the top of the stone steps stood the man she was to marry, Nathaniel Hawke. Duke of Ravenska did not look like the stories whispered in drawing rooms. There were no jewels, no ostentatious gold. He wore a simple dark coat that fit his tall frame like it had been cut from the night itself, his hair tied back neatly, his expression unreadable. Only the way he braced his weight on one leg and the faint stiffness in his stance hinted at the Battlefield History Society loved to mention when his name came up. The carriage door opened, letting in a rush of cold air. Uncle Charles stepped out first, offering his hand back in a gesture that from the outside might have looked paternal. Evelyn placed her fingers lightly in his, careful and controlled, and descended to the ground. The gravel crunched under her satin shoes. She could feel dozens of eyes on the delicate veil framing her face, on the modest pearls at her throat that had once belonged to her mother. She lifted her chin just enough to be polite, not bold. When her gaze met Nathaniel's at last, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. His eyes were a cool gray, thoughtful rather than cruel. And in that suspended heartbeat, with the wind tugging at her veil and the torches bending low, she had the strange sense that Ravenska itself was holding its breath, waiting to see whether this bargain would save anyone at all. Of footsteps across the black and white marble floor. The great hall had been transformed for the ceremony, but not into the kind of celebration little girls dreamed of. There were flowers, yes, arranged in tall vases along the walls, and candles burned in iron sconces that climbed toward a painted ceiling. Yet the arrangement of people spoke of something other than romance. At the front of the hall stood a table draped in dark cloth, upon which rested a thick leather book and a silver inkwell that gleamed like a small moon. Beside it waited the magistrate, in formal robes, representing the crown more than any notion of faith. Rows of chairs flanked a narrow aisle, filled with men and women in fine clothes, their faces turned toward the couple with curiosity and calculation. Evelyn felt their eyes as a weight more tangible than the pearls at her throat. Some looked bored, some speculative, and a few wore the tight little smiles of those who delighted in other people's transitions, whether upward or down. Toward the left, a man rose slightly from his chair. His hair was dark, his waistcoat expensive, his smile sharpened at the edges. Lord Edmund Blackwell, Evelyn realized from half-heard conversations in drawing rooms. His gaze touched her, and then slid toward Nathaniel with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to games that never involved dice, only people. Nathaniel offered his arm, and Evelyn placed her hand lightly upon it, feeling the subtle solidity beneath the fabric of his coat. As they walked down the aisle, the murmurs in the hall dimmed, leaving only the soft hiss of candles and the faint rustle of silk and wool. Each step sounded louder than the last, measured and irreversible. At the table, the magistrate opened the book, pages wide and waiting. "We are gathered," he began, his voice carrying clearly, "to witness the union of Nathaniel Hawke, Duke of Ravenska, and Evelyn Hart, in lawful marriage, bound by the laws of this land and by the duties each owes the other." Duties. The word settled heavily. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He responded when prompted, his vows spoken with the calm precision of a man who had negotiated treaties and battle lines. He promised protection, provision, and honor, each word fitting into place like a stone in a wall. Yet he did not speak of love, and no one in the hall seemed to expect him to. When it was Evelyn's turn, the magistrate's gaze softened a fraction, as if he, at least, recognized the imbalance of power on display. She repeated the phrases handed to her, vows about obedience and respect, about keeping the household and standing beside her husband in public, even when the private cost felt unknown. Her voice was quiet, but each syllable was clear. Somewhere near the back, Uncle Charles exhaled in satisfaction, as though a business deal had been pushed past its final obstacle. As she spoke, Evelyn became aware of Nathaniel's attention resting fully on her for the first time, not on the dress or the veil, but on the way her eyes did not dart around the room seeking rescue. They met the magistrate's, then his, and held. When he took her hand for the signing, his touch was firm and brief. The quill felt heavier than it should when it rested between her fingers. Her name already appeared on the page, written in a practiced hand, a copy of her own signature that had been imitated on other documents she had not been allowed to read. For a heartbeat, the ink blurred. Then she signed, sealing a future she could not map. As the magistrate declared them husband and wife, polite applause rose from the guests, a crackling sound like distant rain on stone. Nathaniel turned to face the hall, Evelyn at his side, and together they received the gaze of those who would talk about this night over supper and in carriages, reducing lives to a story and a headline. Somewhere above them, beyond the painted ceiling and heavy beams, the wind pressed against the castle walls, testing them, as if to see whether this new bond would hold when the real storm finally arrived. The applause faded into the clink of glassware and the low murmur of conversation as servants began to circulate with trays of wine and delicate pastries. The formal part was over, yet the air in the great hall felt heavier to Evelyn, as if everyone could see the invisible line that now tied her to the man at her side. Uncle Charles had already found his way to a cluster of influential guests, laughing a little too loudly, gesturing with a glass in his hand, as if he were the one who had just secured a title. Lord Edmund Blackwell watched from near a tall window, his expression politely amused, his eyes a shade too intent. Nathaniel stood composed through the brief toasts offered in his honor, replying with simple acknowledgments that revealed nothing more than courtesy required. When one elderly baron joked about the strength of Ravenska's new alliance, Nathaniel inclined his head and said, "Ravenska stands. That is all that matters," in a tone that suggested he had repeated versions of that sentence for years. Evelyn felt herself grow still inside. Alliance, duty, survival. These seemed to be the vocabulary of this world, not affection or tenderness. When at last the magistrate closed the leather book and the more formal congratulations dwindled, a senior servant approached and bowed slightly. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the household is ready whenever you wish." Evelyn did not need anyone to explain what that meant. A subtle shift went through the hall, a shared understanding that the next ritual of the evening belonged not to public ceremony, but to private obligation. Nathaniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We have fulfilled what was required of us in front of witnesses," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Now there are other expectations." The words were stark, but there was no cruelty in them, only a kind of weary honesty. He offered his arm again. Evelyn placed her hand upon it, her fingers light, as if she were afraid to leave a mark. Together they left the hall. The great doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound, and the noise of the guests fell away like water running off stone. The corridor beyond was narrower, lined with portraits and lit by a long procession of wall sconces. Flames wavered inside the glass chimneys, casting gentle halos on the dark wood paneling. Their combined footsteps echoed in the hush. As they began to climb the wide staircase, Elvyn became more aware of the rhythm of Nathaniel's movement. He took each step with controlled steadiness, but there was a faint pause now and then, a small adjustment of balance that hinted at an old injury. She did not stare, yet she noticed. War, she remembered hearing in passing. Campaigns in distant fields, where men came back, changed in ways society preferred not to name. Halfway up, a draft slipped through a tall, arched window and lifted the edge of her skirt. She released his arm for a heartbeat to catch the fabric, and the movement exposed the narrow line of her ankle above the shoe, where the skin bore a slight discoloration that did not match any graceful story of a misstep on a dance floor. Nathaniel's gaze dropped there instinctively, then rose at once, the observation tucked swiftly behind the disciplined calm of his features. "If you are tired, we can pause," he said, as though he had noticed nothing at all. "The day has been long." "I am well, Your Grace," Elvyn answered. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if it belonged to the silk dress and the veil, not to the girl who lived inside them. At the top of the staircase, the corridor turned, leading into a quieter wing where the air held the softer sense of beeswax and clean linen. There were fewer portraits here, more closed doors. The torches burned lower, their light warmer, less ceremonial. Nathaniel walked beside her in silence for a few moments before he spoke again. "There are certain expectations of a marriage such as ours," he said. "I do not intend to pretend otherwise. This union protects my estate, and it shields your family from financial ruin. That is the plain truth." The word shields did not escape her notice. "I understand," Elvyn replied. She kept her gaze ahead, where a pair of carved double doors waited at the end of the hall, their panels polished to a soft sheen. "I will do what is required of me." Something tightened, almost imperceptibly, at the corners of his mouth. "I ask only that you keep the outward forms," he said. "In public, you will be treated as Duchess of Ravenska. In private, I will not demand more than you can reasonably give." It was an odd reassurance, yet it was more than any promise she had expected. They stopped before the doors. Nathaniel dismissed the waiting maid with a quiet word, leaving only the two of them in the corridor, the silence between their heartbeats stretching. For an instant, Elvyn thought of all the rooms she had entered in her life, where she had no choice and no power. This door felt like another threshold into the unknown, yet the unknown had always come for her whether she welcomed it or not. Nathaniel's hand rested briefly on the brass handle. He did not look at her with hunger or tenderness, only with a steady attention that carried a hint of curiosity, as if he were as uncertain of what waited inside as she was. Then he pushed the door open, and warm light poured out over them, inviting and unyielding all at once. The room beyond the doors was large, but not ostentatious, lit by a dozen candles clustered on the mantel and on the small tables near the walls. Their light deepened the rich tones of the carved furniture and caught the soft sheen of the cream-colored bed linens. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, its glow reflecting in the glass of a tall mirror and in the polished brass of the bedposts. The world of guests and signatures and watchful eyes felt suddenly distant, like a story that belonged to someone else. Nathaniel stepped aside to allow Elvyn to enter first. For a breath, she remained on the threshold, fingers resting lightly on her skirts, taking in the space that would now, at least in name, be hers. There was a sitting area near the fire with two armchairs, a small writing desk by the window, and a screen in the corner where a dressing table waited, the silver-backed brush and comb aligned with perfect care. It was a beautiful room, crafted for comfort, yet Elvyn's chest tightened all the same. Beauty did not always mean safety. She moved forward slowly, the train of her gown whispering across the rug. The door closed with a soft click behind them. That sound drew a thin line across her thoughts. How many times had she heard a door close and known that whatever happened next could not be witnessed, could not be stopped? The memory stirred a shallow, quickened breath in her throat. Nathaniel shrugged off his formal coat. folding it over the back of a chair with a practiced motion that spoke of habit rather than haste. His white shirt, open at the throat, revealed only a hint of the man beneath the uniform of propriety, but even that small, unguarded line of skin felt suddenly too intimate for her unsteady heart. He seemed to sense it. He did not come closer at once. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and took the iron poker, nudging a log so that the flames rose a little higher, chasing the shadows deeper into the corners of the room. "If you are cold, there is more wood," he said quietly. The ordinary nature of the remark steadied her more than any grand speech might have done. "Thank you, Your Grace," Evelyn replied, her voice softer than she intended. She moved toward the dressing screen, where a folded night robe of fine cotton had been laid out, clearly prepared by thoughtful staff who did not know her, but had anticipated the needs of any bride. Her hands hovered over the fabric. The idea of ringing for a maid to help her out of the gown made her stomach knot. She had grown used to managing alone, even when it meant awkward angles and trembling fingers. Behind her, footsteps approached but stopped at a polite distance. "Evelyn," Nathaniel said, and it was the first time he had spoken her name without any title. She turned, slowly. He stood several feet away, enough that she did not feel crowded, but his attention was entirely on her. "I will be direct," he continued. "The law and tradition expect that our marriage be completed tonight. That expectation protects certain rights, for both of us. I will not pretend that is not the case." Her fingers closed around the edge of the cotton robe, anchoring her. This was it, then. The point beyond which there was no turning back. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thinner. She inclined her head, trying to mold her features into calm. "I understand," she said. The candlelight flickered as if in response. Nathaniel's gaze swept over her face, her shoulders, the lines of tension in her posture. His eyes were not hungry. They were measuring, thinking. His attention dipped briefly to where her sleeves met her gloves, where the fine material of the gown pulled just enough to reveal the edge of skin at her wrist. The lamplight revealed subtle discoloration beneath the pale surface, a pattern that did not come from accident or clumsiness, but from something older and more deliberate. He did not reach for her arm. He did not step closer. Instead, his voice dropped, gentle but firm. "You are breathing as if there is not enough air in this room," he observed. "Tell me honestly, are you afraid of me? Or of what you believe must happen between us tonight?" The question startled her more than any movement might have done. Her throat worked. Truth nudged against years of silence. "I am not afraid of you, Your Grace," she whispered after a moment. "I am afraid of doors that close." For a long second, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Something in his expression changed then, a small shift, like a door inside his own past opening a fraction. He studied her face, the quiet panic in her eyes, the way she held herself braced as if for impact that never came. When he spoke again, each word seemed chosen with care. "Then let us be clear," he said. "I will not touch you in any way that you do not choose. Not tonight. Not ever. Our marriage may have been arranged as a matter of necessity, but what happens in this room will not be dictated by fear." Evelyn had not realized she had been holding her breath until it left her in a shaky exhale. With it went a fraction of the weight on her shoulders. The night was still uncertain, the future still bound in obligation, but there was a line now that someone else had drawn in her favor. It felt fragile and astonishing, like the first pale light before dawn. For a moment neither of them moved. The statement hung between them, fragile and surprising, as if it had not only changed the rules of the room but nudged the walls themselves a little farther apart. Evelyn realized she was still standing very straight, shoulders tight, as though some invisible commandment demanded perfect posture at all times. When she forced herself to lower them, a small ache traveled through muscle and bone, the echo of long-practiced tension. Nathaniel seemed to notice that, too. He turned slightly, giving her the courtesy of his profile rather than his full, steady gaze. "If you wish to change, there is a bell by the dressing table," he said. "You may call for assistance or not, as you prefer. I will remain over here by the fire until you are ready." It was such a simple arrangement, so obvious that she might have laughed if laughter had not felt like a language she no longer spoke. Instead she nodded, even though he was not looking directly at her. "Thank you," she replied. The cotton robe waited, soft and pale against the darker wood. Evelyn moved behind the folding screen, the world narrowing to the rustle of fabric and the quiet thump of her heart. Her fingers worked at the tiny buttons along the back of her gown, a row that seemed to stretch for miles. The dress had been fastened earlier by a maid with quick, practiced hands. Undoing it alone was another matter entirely. After the third button refused to cooperate, her shoulders began to tremble with the strain of reaching back at that angle. She stopped, pressing her forehead lightly against the smooth panel of the screen, willing her breath to steady. Behind her, she could hear Nathaniel set something down, perhaps his cufflinks or his pocket watch, the small metallic sound quickly swallowed by the crackle of the fire. "Is everything all right?" he asked. He did not raise his voice. The question came to her as gently as the glow of the hearth. Evelyn considered the bell, considered the pride that had carried her through years of learning to manage alone, bruised in ways no one had cared to see. "It is only these buttons," she said at last, the words muffled by the screen. "They are stubborn." There was the soft scrape of a chair. "May I send for a maid?" he offered. "Or, if you prefer, I could assist, with your permission. You may keep your back turned and the screen between us. I would only need to unfasten what you cannot reach." The picture that rose in her mind was not of a man invading a private space, but of a soldier offering a hand to someone caught on a steep path. Still, habit made her hesitate. Habit remembered help that had come with a price. She drew a slow breath. "The maid will only bring more questions," she said quietly. "If you are willing, Your Grace, I would accept your help." For a moment there was silence, and then the faint rustle of his steps approached. He did not come around the screen. Instead, his hand appeared at the edge, knuckles brushed with firelight. "May I?" he asked. She placed her gloved fingers in his for the briefest instant, enough to guide him to the first of the undone buttons. Then she turned so that her back was fully to him, the screen still hiding most of her form from view. The satin at her shoulders slipped an inch, revealing the top line of her spine and the delicate curve where her neck met her back. The air touched skin that had rarely been bare without apprehension. Nathaniel's fingers were efficient and careful. He worked each button free with the same calm precision he had used when he signed his name in the book downstairs. Yet when the fabric loosened enough to shift, the neckline dipped just a little lower, and the candlelight fell on the skin beneath. What it revealed was not the unmarked smoothness expected of a sheltered young bride. The tone of her back varied, faint lines of uneven color running across the pale surface, like the ghost of old storms mapped in muted shades. They were not fresh. They spoke of time and repetition, of something that had once hurt and had been allowed to fade without ever fully vanishing. His hand stilled. He did not touch the marks, did not trace them, but he could not unsee them. A slow, controlled breath left him, visible only in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders on the other side of the screen. "Evelyn," he said, and her name held an unfamiliar weight, as if he were addressing not just the woman in the gown but the history written on her skin. "How long have you carried these?" For an instant panic surged in her chest, wild and wordless. She clutched the loosened bodice closer, even though the screen already spared her from his full view. The instinct to deny, to brush it away as nothing, rose to her lips, the old reflex of survival. But something in his tone stopped her. There was no accusation in it, only a contained anger that did not seem directed at her at all. "A long time," she answered finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Long enough that I stopped counting." He was quiet, but she sensed him there, the warmth of another person trying very hard not to crowd her sorrow. When he spoke again, his words were measured, each one placed with care. "Whoever allowed this to happen to you," he said, "has treated you with a carelessness that no one under my protection will ever face again. Do you understand me?" The phrase "under my protection" settled over her shoulders like a new kind of garment, one that fit awkwardly but promised warmth. She nodded, even though he could not see it. "Yes, Your Grace," she murmured. "I understand." "Good," he replied softly. He finished the last obstinate button with renewed gentleness, then stepped back, his hand withdrawing from the edge of the screen. "I will turn my back now. Take whatever time you need. When you are ready, we can talk, or we can simply sit by the fire until the night grows tired of watching us. Either way, you will not face its shadows alone." For the first time in years, as Evelyn slipped out of the heavy satin and into the waiting softness of the robe, The sound of a door closed did not feel like the beginning of a sentence she already knew. It felt like the pause before a new line, one she had not yet heard spoken aloud. When Evelyn stepped out from behind the screen, the robe tied neatly at her waist, and her hair loosened from the heavy arrangement, the room felt different, as if someone had opened a window in a house that had been closed for years even though the glass remained shut. Nathaniel stood with his back partially turned, one hand resting on the mantel, watching the fire as if measuring its strength. At the quiet scuff of her bare feet on the rug, he glanced over his shoulder, then fully faced her. The sharp edges of ceremony were gone from his features. What remained was a composed tiredness and a focus that rested entirely on her, not as a possession but as a person whose presence altered the space. "May I sit?" she asked, indicating the armchair nearest the fire. It felt important to ask, even here, in a room that had been prepared for her. "You may sit wherever you are most comfortable," he replied, "including sending me out entirely, if that is what you wish." A faint, surprised sound escaped her, almost a laugh, quickly tamed. "Please stay," she said. "The room is large. The night feels larger." He inclined his head and took the other chair, leaving a respectful distance between them, an invisible line drawn by consideration rather than duty. For a while they sat in silence, the gentle pop of the logs and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall filling the quiet. The robe's fabric was warm against her skin, light where the gown had been heavy. She let her hands rest in her lap, fingers no longer clenched. "You said I am under your protection now," Evelyn ventured, her gaze on the flames. "Do you extend that to inconvenient truths as well as polite ones?" Nathaniel looked at her more closely. "Protection that only covers what is comfortable is no protection at all," he said. "If there is something I should know, I would rather hear it from you than from those who might twist it to their advantage." The words settled around her like a promise. She drew a breath, not as shallow as before. "My uncle has used my name for a long time," she said slowly. "On papers I was not allowed to read. I was told it was for the good of the family, that I owed him my signature because he kept a roof over our heads. There were ledgers, and visitors who spoke in numbers more than sentences. I signed where he pointed because I believed I had no choice." Nathaniel's expression did not change dramatically, but his eyes sharpened. "Did you ever see what kind of agreements he was making?" he asked. "Did you recognize any of the seals or crests?" Evelyn searched her memory, the careful parade of symbols that had drifted across parchment in front of her, each one heavy with meaning no one had thought she was worth explaining. "There was a hawk once," she said at last, "carved very finely in wax. I remember because it looked as if it might fly if you opened the envelope. My uncle was in a better mood that day than usual." Nathaniel sat very still. The air between them tightened, not with threat, but with realization. "That would have been a contract concerning Ravenska," he said. "Your name may already be tied to my estate in ways the law takes very seriously." Somewhere far below their feet, in the lower corridors of the castle, Uncle Charles Hart was not sitting by any fire. He stood near a sideboard where glasses had been hastily gathered after the guests drifted away, his expression pinched with restless calculation. Lord Edmund Blackwell leaned one shoulder against the wall, turning the stem of his empty glass between his fingers as if considering how easily such things could shatter. "You are certain the Duke will not simply let her talk?" Edmund asked, his tone almost casual. "Some husbands prefer not to examine the details of the past too closely." Charles's jaw tightened. "Nathaniel Hawke is not a man who overlooks details," he muttered. "If she becomes sentimental and shares anything about our arrangements, certain accounts may be questioned. I intend to prevent that. A very generous decanter is being sent up to the bridal chambers as we speak. With the right encouragement, tongues can be guided or kept pleasantly heavy." He did not notice the quiet figure standing in the shadow of a nearby archway, listening without appearing to listen. Captain James Rowan, Nathaniel's long-trusted officer now turned household captain, watched the two men with the same calm attention he had once reserved for distant hillsides where movement might mean danger. When Charles moved away, Rowan stepped forward and intercepted the young footman carrying a polished tray with a cut crystal decanter and 2 glasses. "I will take that," Rowan said mildly. "His Grace has already given instructions about this evening." The footman, accustomed to obeying the captain, surrendered the tray at once, relieved to be spared a late night errand to the far wing. Rowan changed direction without fuss, and the tray never reached the door it had been intended for. Later, when he reported to Nathaniel outside the bedchamber, his words were very simple. "Some guests are thinking too creatively, Your Grace," he said. "I have adjusted their plans. The household corridor is secure." Nathaniel's eyes cooled, but he only nodded. "See that it remains so," he answered. When he re-entered the room, Evelyn looked up, a question flickering in her gaze. He closed the door with care, not with the finality of a barrier, but with the intent of a shield. "There may be more to untangle than either of us realized," he said, returning to his chair. "But whatever has been written in your name without your consent, we will face it with our eyes open. This house has many doors, Evelyn. The only ones that will close on you now are the ones you choose." The wind outside pressed against the windows, a low, constant sound, but inside the chamber the air felt steady. For the first time in a very long while, she did not feel like someone waiting to be summoned or dismissed. She felt, tentatively, like someone who had just been invited to stay. The fire had settled into a steady glow, no longer leaping, just breathing quietly against the stone. Shadows lay softer now along the walls, less like threats and more like curtains drawn between one hour and the next. Evelyn watched the light move over the lines of Nathaniel's face as he considered what she had told him, the mention of the hawk seal, the signatures pressed from her hand without permission. He leaned back in his chair, one elbow on the armrest, fingers resting lightly against his chin. "Before the wedding," he said at last, "I asked my steward to look into certain matters regarding your uncle. Debts, investments, unusual movements of funds. At the time it was only prudent caution. Now I see it was not enough." Evelyn's hands tightened slightly in the folds of her robe. "You suspected something was wrong," she said. "It was not quite a question." "I suspected he was careless with money," Nathaniel replied. "That is different from suspecting he was careless with people. The law frowns on the first. I find the second far more offensive." He rose then, with that same measured steadiness she had noticed on the stairs, and crossed to a small writing desk in the corner. From one of the drawers, he withdrew a slim leather folder bound with a strap. He did not bring it straight to her. Instead, he paused by the mantel, as if weighing whether to press this new weight onto a night that had already carried more than she might bear. "If you would rather postpone this until morning, we can," he offered. "You have endured enough for one day." Evelyn surprised herself by shaking her head. "My uncle has delayed the truth for years," she said quietly. "I do not wish to add even one more night to his success." Something like respect flickered in his gaze. He brought the folder to the small table between their chairs and sat again, positioning it so that she could see as clearly as he did. When he loosened the strap and opened the cover, crisp parchment and careful columns of ink greeted them. Names, sums, dates, seals pressed into wax that had long since hardened. "These are copies," he told her. "The originals sit in various offices and vaults. But the pattern is clear. Your uncle borrowed against future profits, used your name as security, and promised portions of Ravenska's coastal rights in exchange for certain favors." His finger traced one line where her name appeared beside an elegant flourish that was supposed to be her approval. The letters were right, but the hand was not hers. "He said the documents were too legal for me to understand," she murmured. "He said my part was to trust him." She remembered the sharp smell of ink, the scrape of a pen, the way the room had felt smaller each time she was told to sign. "Did he ever mention Lord Edmund Blackwell by name?" Nathaniel asked. "I heard it spoken once," she answered. "They took wine in my uncle's study. I was told to leave the tray and not to linger, but I heard them laugh about how certain lands would change hands so quietly that even the cliffs would not notice." Nathaniel closed the folder with a controlled motion, as if he had seen enough for one sitting. "Then it is as I feared," he said. "Edmund has been circling Ravenska for years. Your uncle gave him a way to reach for it through you." Evelyn absorbed that in silence. The idea that her own name had been used as a lever against the very place that now sheltered her made her stomach turn. "If I speak of this," she said slowly, "if I tell an official what I remember, will it be enough to matter?" "Yes," Nathaniel said, without hesitation. "You are not a bystander in these dealings. You are the person whose signature was taken, whose consent was assumed. The law must hear that. And more importantly, I must hear it, so that any agreement touching Ravenska is not built on your harm." She lowered her gaze to her hands. The faint shadows on her skin were hidden now by the robe, but she felt their presence all the same. "My brother still lives with my uncle," she said, the words coming out on a breath she had been holding for years. "Thomas is younger, and my uncle believes fear is a tool that works best when shared. If I speak against him, Thomas may suffer for it." Nathaniel did not dismiss this, did not tell her that she worried too much or that the world would surely be fair. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting the reality she laid between them. "Then the first thing we will do," he said, "is arrange for your brother to be brought here under a pretext that does not alarm your uncle. A visit to celebrate your new position, perhaps. Once Thomas is in these walls, he will not be returned to a household that has treated you as he has." The certainty in his tone did something to the cold center of her chest that years of endurance had not managed. "You would do that," she said, "even though taking us both in means taking on all the trouble that follows us." "Ravinska has stood through storms that lasted longer than any man's schemes," he replied. "I would rather weather trouble with honest allies than enjoy peace purchased with silence." The clock on the wall marked another minute. The fire sank a little lower. Evelyn exhaled, and this time the breath left her without shaking. The night had not turned into the duty others had expected of it. Instead, it had become something stranger and more fragile, a quiet agreement forged in the space between old wounds and new vows. For the first time, she felt that the marks she carried, both seen and unseen, might one day be read not as evidence of her weakness, but as a testimony that someone had finally decided they would not be ignored. By the time the clock on the wall chimed the next hour, the fire had burned down to a mellow bed of embers, and the edges of Evelyn's thoughts had softened with weariness. The night had stretched longer than any she could remember, not with the kind of fear that left her counting heartbeats, but with a new kind of alertness that left her reluctant to close her eyes in case the fragile balance between them dissolved. Nathaniel noticed the heaviness gathering in her gaze. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Whatever we must face will still be there in the morning. Exhaustion has never yet improved a difficult decision." She looked toward the great bed with its canopy drawn back, linen smooth and untouched. A part of her balked at the idea of lying down in it while he remained awake nearby, not because she feared him, but because old habits whispered that it was unwise to be the only one asleep in any room. As if sensing that, he stood and crossed to a small chest by the wall, retrieving an extra blanket. "There is a sofa by the window," he said. "I will take that tonight. It is not the first time I have slept in something less than ideal, I assure you." "You need not do that on my account," Evelyn protested, startled. "This is your room. I am the one who has just arrived." "It is our room now," he corrected gently, "and our arrangement. Let us begin as we mean to continue, with a measure of respect. You will sleep more easily in the bed knowing I am not beside you. I will sleep more easily knowing you are not standing guard against me." The frankness of the statement disarmed any further argument. She inclined her head, something easing in her chest. "Very well," she said. "Thank you." When she finally lay down, the mattress soft beneath her and the blankets drawn up to her shoulders, she stared for a long time at the pattern carved into the canopy supports, listening to the faint sounds of Nathaniel moving about the room. The quiet creak of the sofa as he settled onto it felt strangely comforting, the way a steady heartbeat does in a darkened house. Sleep came in slow waves, but when it reached her, it was deeper than she expected. Morning arrived as a cool gray light seeping around the edges of the curtains. The fire had burned low again, but the room held the leftover warmth of the night. Evelyn blinked, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar ceiling, then remembered where she was, and more importantly, remembered that she had not woken to anger or pounding footsteps. Nathaniel was already up, standing by the writing desk in shirt sleeves, a sheet of paper before him and a pen moving with deliberate strokes. The lines of his posture were sharper in the morning light, more defined, like the castle itself. He looked up when she shifted, and something in his face softened. "Good morning, Duchess," he said. The title felt different on his tongue than when the magistrate had used it. Less ceremonial, more acknowledging. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, her voice roughened slightly by sleep. She sat up, smoothing the blanket over her legs, suddenly self-conscious and yet oddly unafraid. "You have been working already?" "There is always work," he said, with a hint of wryness. Today's is more interesting than most. He tapped the paper lightly. A letter to your uncle, inviting him to extend his stay for a few days under the guise of advising you on certain household transitions. He will not be able to resist the opportunity to hover near the seat of influence he believes he helped secure. And Thomas? She asked, the question rushing out before she could temper it. There is a second letter, Nathaniel said. This one to your brother directly, written in terms your uncle need not see in full. An invitation to visit his sister at Ravenska, accompanied by a small allowance for travel and the suggestion that I require a youthful companion with a good head for numbers to assist my steward. That should appeal to him, if your description of his curiosity is accurate. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. Thomas, here, within walls that did not echo with the same old threats. It seemed almost too much to hope for, and yet the sight of Nathaniel's steady hand sealing the letters with wax and the imprint of the hawk made it real in a way dreaming never had. You have arranged all of this before breakfast, she said. I am a man who prefers to move before others realize the ground beneath them is shifting, he answered. Your uncle and Lord Edmund have relied on shadows and confusion. I have found that bringing matters into clear light unsettles such men more than anything else. A knock came at the door, polite and soft. Nathaniel crossed the room, opened it just enough to speak to someone outside, then returned with a tray bearing tea, fresh bread, and fruit. You will need strength for what lies ahead, he said, setting the tray on the small table. Today we begin to gather everything that has been done in your name. Soon enough, others will come asking questions. When they do, I want you to have your own answers ready. As she wrapped her hands around the warm cup, Evelyn realized that for the first time, the story of her life was no longer something being written for her. It was something she was being invited to read aloud, with someone beside her who was finally willing to listen. By midday, the castle had begun to adjust around the fact that its master was no longer simply a solitary figure moving through its halls. Word traveled faster than the sea wind that a new Duchess walked the corridors, and as Evelyn accompanied Nathaniel through the upper floors, she felt the subtle shift in glances that followed them. Curiosity, caution, in some faces a quiet hope that a gentler influence might now live where only discipline had ruled. Nathaniel kept his pace steady beside her, never striding so far ahead that she had to hurry to match him. He showed her the long gallery with its tall windows looking out over the gray sweep of the ocean, the small chapel tucked behind carved doors, the library where the scent of leather bindings and ink formed its own kind of sanctuary. In each place, he did not lecture. He simply said, if ever you wish to be alone, this room holds its peace well, or, the light is good here in the mornings, if you care for reading. At one point Captain Rowan appeared at the end of a corridor, conversing quietly with a footman who looked a little pale. When he saw them, he bowed, his respect not only for the Duke, but for the woman at his side. The letters have been dispatched, Your Grace, he reported. One by the main post, as expected, and one by private rider with instructions to place it directly into young Thomas Hart's hand. Evelyn's breath caught. The world outside Ravenska had not simply been shut behind her. A line had been cast back into it. Thank you, Captain, Nathaniel said. He did not need to look at Evelyn to feel the way that news had steadied her. Yet he glanced at her anyway, and in that fleeting contact she saw that he understood just how much courage it took for hope to follow fear rather than be extinguished by it. Later, in the library, the afternoon light fell in pale bands across the floor. Dust motes drifted like distant stars between high shelves. Nathaniel rested his hand on the back of a chair, his fingers curving around the worn wood where countless others had done the same. I spent many nights here after the war, he said, his tone more reflective than she had heard before. I thought, if I filled my head with enough words, there would be less room for the things I had seen. Evelyn listened, surprised that he offered this without being asked. Did it help, she said. He considered. Not in the way I expected, he answered. The memories remained. But I began to understand that carrying scars does not mean one is only the scar. It means one survived long enough to earn it. He did not look at her wrists or her shoulders, yet the meaning settled gently over both of them. As evening draped itself over Ravenska once more, the castle quieted. Lamps were lit, shutters checked, doors secured against the persistent sea wind. In their chamber, the fire built anew, Evelyn found that the room no longer felt like a stage awaiting a dreaded performance. It felt, cautiously, like a place where the day could lay down its burdens. Nathaniel stood by the window, the last streaks of color fading behind him. "Tomorrow I will send word to a magistrate I trust," he said. "Discreetly at first. We will not announce a battle before we have chosen our ground." "And when my uncle realizes the ground has shifted?" she asked. "Then he will discover that the person he treated as a tool now has the power to testify," Nathaniel said. "He may find that more difficult to dismiss than he imagines." She crossed the room slowly, the hem of her gown whispering against the rug. For a heartbeat, she watched his reflection in the glass, the faint outline of the man who had chosen to believe her on a night when it would have been easier not to ask any questions at all. "You said the scars we carry mean we survived," she murmured. "Does surviving ever become more than simply enduring?" He turned from the window, his expression unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "I believe it can," he said. "I have seen men who stayed alive out of habit, and others who chose to live with intention. The difference often began the moment someone looked at them and saw more than what had hurt them." Her pulse fluttered, not with the sharpness of fear this time, but with something tentative and new. She stepped closer, close enough that the firelight touched them both. Slowly, as if giving both of them time to reconsider, she lifted her hand and laid it over his, where it rested on the window frame. His skin was warm, the bones solid beneath it. He did not close his fingers around hers at once. He let her decide whether to stay. When she did not pull away, his hand turned, his palm meeting hers in a steady, quiet clasp. There was no declaration, no grand vow spoken into the air. There was only the small, deeply felt truth of two people standing side by side at the edge of an uncertain future, choosing, for the first time, not to face it alone. Outside, the waves continued their ceaseless conversation with the cliffs. Inside, a different conversation had begun, one written not in ink or contracts, but in the simple exchange of trust. The marks Evelyn hid beneath silk and lace were still there, and they would not vanish overnight, but they no longer existed only as proof of what she had suffered. In the soft hush of that room, they began to reshape themselves into evidence of something else entirely, that even the most wounded hearts can learn to beat differently when someone finally dares to see them and stays.